At 11:22 hours on June 7, 1944, Corporal Daniel Mora crouched under the port wing of an F4U Corsair at Piva Yoke Airfield on Bougainville, watching his pilot prepare for a mission against what the intelligence officer called the best pilots Japan has left. The pilot was Lieutenant James Keller, 24 years old, 17 combat missions, 4 confirmed kills. The Japanese had sent 12 A6M50s, escorted by 4 of their top aces from the 204th Air Group, to intercept the American fighter sweep. Keller would be flying straight into them. Mora had been maintaining Corsairs for 7 months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Single-engine fighter, inverted gull wing, 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine, fast in level flight, brutal in a dive, heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns. But the Corsair had one characteristic that was getting Marine pilots killed every single week. It couldn't accelerate fast enough when it mattered most. The throttle linkage had a governor, a mechanical safety device that limited how quickly a pilot could advance the throttle from cruise power to combat power. The governor was there for good reason. Slamming the throttle forward too fast could cause the engine to backfire, could flood the carburetor, could cause catastrophic mechanical failure. So Pratt & Whitney had installed a spring-loaded mechanism that limited throttle movement to a specific rate. No matter how hard a pilot shoved the throttle forward, the engine would only accelerate at the governed rate, 3.8 seconds from cruise to maximum continuous power. In most situations, that was fine, but in combat, 3.8 seconds was an eternity. When a Zero dove on you from above and you needed maximum power right now, waiting for the governor to allow your engine to spool up meant the Zero got guns on you before you could accelerate away. American doctrine said Corsair pilots should maintain situational awareness and avoid being caught at low power settings. Keep the engine at high power during combat. Be ready. Keller had tried that doctrine 16 times. It hadn't worked. You couldn't keep the engine at combat power for the entire mission. The fuel consumption was too high. You'd run out of gas before getting home. So pilots cruised at reduced power to conserve fuel, then advanced to combat power when they engaged the enemy. And in that 3.8 seconds, while the governor allowed the engine to spool up, Zero pilots who knew the timing could close the distance and shoot. The Marine Corps had lost 41 Corsairs in the past 2 months in the Solomons. 14 were shot down after being caught at low power settings during the acceleration phase. The pilots saw the threat, pushed the throttle forward, waited for the power to come. The power came too late. The Zeros shot them down before they could accelerate away. Mora had watched too many pilots die. Good men. They climbed into their Corsairs with confidence and came back in body bags or didn't come back at all. The training manual said the problem was poor energy management. The instructors said these pilots weren't maintaining adequate power settings during combat. But Mora knew better. The problem wasn't the pilots. It was the throttle governor. The first pilot Mora lost to a Zero was Second Lieutenant Paul Martinez, April 16, 1944. Martinez had been in theater for 5 weeks. Mora had worked on his aircraft every morning. They talked about California. Martinez was from San Diego. Mora was from Los Angeles. They'd both worked on hot rods before the war. Martinez understood engines. He knew how to manage power. Martinez took off at 0630 on a fighter sweep over Rabaul. He came back 90 minutes later with bullet holes in his tail section and a story about a Zero that had caught him during acceleration. Martinez said he'd been cruising at reduced power when 2 Zeros bounced him from above. He saw them coming, pushed his throttle forward. The engine started to spool up, but it took time. The governor wouldn't let him slam to full power. He needed maximum acceleration right then. The engine gave him a gradual increase. The lead Zero got a 3-second burst into his tail before Martinez's wingman drove it off. Mora looked at the bullet holes. They were in a tight group, professional shooting. The Zero pilot had led Martinez perfectly, had known exactly how long it would take for the Corsair to accelerate. That shouldn't have been possible if Martinez had gotten immediate power response, unless the Zero pilot knew about the governor, knew that American pilots would push their throttles forward and then have to wait 3.8 seconds while their engine caught up with what they needed. Martinez flew 7 more missions. On May 3rd, he was killed over Caviang. Same story. Caught during acceleration. Couldn't get power fast enough. The Zero stayed with him through the initial dive. Shot him down at 8,000 feet. Martinez's wingman said it looked like Martinez's engine was slow to respond, like he was fighting the throttle. Martinez died in the crash. The second pilot was Captain Robert Hayes. Hayes was a flight leader, experienced, 9 kills. He knew the Corsair inside and out, knew its limitations, flew smart. On May 18th, Hayes's flight intercepted 6 Zeros at 16,000 feet over New Georgia. Hayes got 1 Zero on the first pass, came around for another run. 2 Zeros were versed on him. Mora heard the radio traffic afterward. Hayes tried to accelerate away, called out that his engine wasn't giving him power fast enough. The Zeros stayed with him through the acceleration, got guns on him. Hayes took 20mm cannon shells through his cockpit. He managed to ditch near a destroyer, got picked up alive, but he'd taken shrapnel to his left arm and wouldn't fly again.
Hayes's crew chief was a friend of Morris, a guy named Sullivan from Boston. Sullivan was convinced there was something wrong with Hayes's aircraft. He checked everything after Hayes ditched. Engine timing, magnetos, throttle linkage, everything was within spec. Nothing wrong with the airplane. The engine performed exactly as designed. The governor was working perfectly. But Hayes had still been shot down because his engine wouldn't give him the power he needed when he needed it. By early June, Mora had watched 11 pilots get shot down or killed. Some he knew well. Most he'd only met briefly while doing pre-flight checks. But he'd worked on all their aircraft, had signed off their maintenance logs, had watched them taxi out, take off, fly into combat. Some came back. Some didn't. The ones who came back told the same story. They needed power, pushed the throttle forward, had to wait for the governor to let the engine respond. In that waiting time, Zeros closed distance and shot. Mora started paying attention to the throttle linkage during maintenance. The governor was a spring-loaded mechanism mounted between the throttle cable and the carburetor control arm. It allowed slow throttle movement, but resisted fast movement. The faster you tried to move the throttle, the more resistance the spring provided. It was elegant engineering. It protected the engine from abuse. But it was getting pilots killed. He mentioned this to Sullivan one evening after Hayes got shot down. Sullivan asked what could be done about it. Mora said nothing official. The governor was a required safety device. Removing it would void the engine warranty and violate maintenance regulations. But unofficially, there was a solution. It just required breaking regulations that could get them both court-martialed. The problem wasn't that Marine pilots didn't know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized power management. Every training flight drilled it. Maintain high power settings during combat. Be ready to accelerate. The doctrine was clear. The problem was that doctrine didn't account for fuel consumption. You couldn't fly the entire mission at high power. The Corsair's fuel capacity didn't allow it. Lieutenant James Keller had been on Bougainville for 3 months. 24 years old, farm kid from Nebraska. He'd flown 17 combat missions and had 4 confirmed kills. Not because he was a bad pilot, because he followed the rules. And the rules kept putting him in situations where his engine couldn't respond fast enough. On his 9th mission, Keller dove on a Zero from altitude, built up speed to 420 miles per hour, came in from above like the manual said, got the Zero in his gun sights, started to pull lead for deflection. The Zero snap-rolled and dove. Keller pulled back to cruise power to conserve fuel, climbed back to altitude. 30 seconds later, 2 Zeros bounced him from his 6 o'clock. Keller saw them, pushed his throttle forward for combat power. The governor delayed his acceleration. The engine spooled up gradually, 3.8 seconds. The lead Zero closed from 400 yards to 250 yards during that time, got a 2-second burst off before Keller's wingman broke them off. No hits, but too close.
11th mission was worse. Keller and his wingman jumped 3 Zeros at 14,000 feet. Keller got the first Zero in his sights, fired, missed. The Zero reversed. Keller reduced power to turn tighter, standard tactic. The Zero came around for a head-on pass. Keller needed power immediately, shoved the throttle forward. The governor made him wait. The Zero was firing. Keller could see the muzzle flashes. Tracers came at him. The engine finally gave him power. He pulled up hard, avoided the burst. The Zero flashed past underneath. But Keller knew if the Zero pilot had been slightly better, those 3 seconds of waiting would have been enough. 15th mission? Keller watched his wingman almost die. The wingman's name was Second Lieutenant David Park, 22 years old, from Oregon. They'd gone through training together. On May 28th, Park got separated from the formation during a dogfight over Choiseul. 3 Zeros got on his tail. Park called for help. Keller heard the panic in his voice, heard Park say his engine wasn't giving him power, heard him say he'd pushed the throttle to the stop, but the Zeros were still closing. Heard the gunfire, heard Park scream. Then Park called that he was on fire, bailing out. Park survived, got picked up by a Catalina flying boat, but he'd taken burns to his hands and face. He wouldn't fly for 3 months, and Keller knew why Park had been shot down. That governor, that 3.8 seconds. Park had needed power immediately. His engine had made him wait. The Zeros hadn't waited. On the evening of June 6th, Keller came to the maintenance area, found Mora working on his assigned Corsair. Keller asked if there was anything Mora could do to make the engine respond faster. Anything at all. Keller said he didn't care if it was regulation or not. He just wanted a chance to fight on equal terms. Wanted his engine to do what he told it to do, when he told it to do it. Mora looked at Keller, saw the fear, saw the frustration, saw a kid who knew he was going to die if something didn't change. Mora told Keller to come back in the morning. He'd see what he could do. Mora worked alone that night. The maintenance area was quiet after 2,200 hours. Most of the crew had gone to their tents. The only sounds were distant generators and the ever-present chorus of jungle insects. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. He pulled the engine cowling off Keller's Corsair. The big Pratt & Whitney R2800 radiated heat even hours after shutdown. The throttle governor was mounted on the starboard side of the engine, between the throttle cable and the carburetor linkage. Mora had been looking at it for weeks, thinking about it, wondering if there was a way to bypass it without causing engine damage.
The governor worked through spring resistance. When a pilot moved the throttle quickly, the spring absorbed the motion, releasing it gradually to the carburetor. The spring was stiff, designed to slow throttle movement to a safe rate. Removing the spring entirely would allow instant throttle response, but would also allow pilots to damage the engine through too rapid throttle application. The engine could backfire, flood, or worse. But Mora had noticed something. The governor limited throttle movement in both directions, fast opening and fast closing. Closing the throttle quickly didn't damage the engine. You could chop the throttle instantly without problems. The engine danger was only from too fast throttle opening. What if the governor could be modified to allow fast closing but slow opening? Or better yet, what if it allowed fast opening only within safe engine parameters? He sat on the tarmac with a flashlight, studying the governor mechanism. The spring was a compression spring mounted inside a cylinder. When the throttle moved, a plunger compressed the spring, which then slowly released, moving the carburetor control arm. The spring rate was constant. It resisted all motion equally. What if the spring was replaced with a stiffer wire that only resisted beyond a certain point? A progressive resistance system. Fast throttle movement up to maximum safe rate would be unrestricted. Beyond that rate, resistance would kick in. The pilot could still slam the throttle forward. The engine would respond immediately up to the safe limit. Only if the pilot moved faster than safe would he feel resistance. The wire came from a damaged Corsair that had ground-looped the previous week. The aircraft was being salvaged for parts. Mora had pulled the governor spring from it, thinking he might need a spare. The spring wire was high-tensile steel, about 6 inches long, coiled. Mora had wire cutters, pliers, and a small grinding wheel in his toolkit. He cut the spring wire to length, 4 inches, ground one end flat, bent it into a shallow U-shape. The U-shape would provide initial flexibility, allowing fast throttle movement, but would stiffen as it compressed, preventing unsafe rates. It was crude engineering, but the principle was sound. Installing it was the hard part. The governor was cramped behind engine accessories. Mora had to work with one hand while holding the flashlight with his teeth. His shoulders ached, sweat ran into his eyes. He dropped the retaining clip twice, heard it bounce off the engine mount, spent 10 minutes feeling around in the dark to find it. He removed the original spring, installed his modified wire. The fit was tight. He had to force it slightly to get the retaining clip seated. When it finally locked in place, he tested it by hand. Moved the throttle cable slowly, the wire flexed smoothly. Moved it quickly. The wire flexed initially, then stiffened. Perfect. Fast throttle movement would be unrestricted up to about 80% of maximum rate. Beyond that rate, resistance would kick in. The pilot could still slam the throttle forward. The engine would respond immediately up to the safe limit. Only if the pilot moved faster than safe would he feel resistance.
The wire came from a damaged Corsair that had ground looped the previous week. The aircraft was being salvaged for parts. Mora had pulled the governor spring from it, thinking he might need a spare. The spring wire was high-tensile steel, about 6 inches long, coiled. Mora had wire cutters, pliers, and a small grinding wheel in his toolkit. He cut the spring wire to length, 4 inches, ground one end flat, bent it into a shallow U-shape. The U-shape would provide initial flexibility, allowing fast throttle movement, but would stiffen as it compressed, preventing unsafe rates. It was crude engineering, but the principle was sound. Installing it was the hard part. The governor was cramped behind engine accessories. Mora had to work with one hand while holding the flashlight with his teeth. His shoulders ached, sweat ran into his eyes. He dropped the retaining clip twice, heard it bounce off the engine mount, spent 10 minutes feeling around in the dark to find it. He removed the original spring, installed his modified wire. The fit was tight. He had to force it slightly to get the retaining clip seated. When it finally locked in place, he tested it by hand. Moved the throttle cable slowly, the wire flexed smoothly. Moved it quickly, the wire flexed initially, then stiffened. Perfect. Fast throttle movement would be unrestricted up to about 80% of maximum rate. Beyond that, resistance would limit further acceleration. The engine would still be protected from damage, but the pilot would get immediate power response in the range that mattered for combat.
Mora replaced the engine cowling, cleaned up his tools, walked away from the aircraft at 01:45. The jungle night was oppressive, humid, alive with sounds. Somewhere in the distance, he heard aircraft engines, probably a Japanese night raid. The sound made his stomach tight. He'd just modified a flight control system without authorization, used a non-standard part, violated at least 6 regulations. If the modification failed during flight, Keller would crash, and Mora would be responsible. But if it worked, Keller might live. Mora went to his tent. Didn't sleep. Watched the canvas ceiling until dawn. At 06:30, he walked to the flight line, watched the crew fuel and arm Keller's aircraft, watched Keller walk out for his pre-flight briefing, watched him climb into the cockpit. At 11:22, Keller took off. Mora stood on the coral runway and watched the Corsair climb into the morning sky, watched it join formation with 11 other aircraft, watched them head northwest toward Japanese airspace. And then, all he could do was wait. The engagement started at 12:04. Keller's flight of 4 Corsairs intercepted 12 Zeros at 18,000 feet over Buka. The morning sun was behind them, perfect setup for a diving attack. Keller was flying number 3 position. His element leader called out the bounce. They rolled in. Keller picked a Zero at the edge of the formation, dove from altitude, built speed to 400 miles per hour. The Zero grew larger in his gun sight. He could see the pilot's head in the canopy. He pressed the trigger. His 6.5 caliber machine guns hammered. Tracers reached out. Several hits sparked off the Zero's wing root. Good hits, but the Zero pulled up hard, reversed. Keller tried to follow, had to reduce power to turn with the Zero. His airspeed dropped to 280 miles per hour. The Zero completed its reversal, came around toward Keller head-on. This was the critical moment. Keller needed maximum power immediately. He shoved the throttle forward, hard, felt it hit the stop. And his engine responded instantly. No delay, no waiting. The R2800 roared. Power surged. Keller felt himself pressed back into his seat. The acceleration was immediate, violent, like someone had kicked the aircraft from behind. He'd never felt his Corsair respond like that. The Zero was firing. Keller pulled up hard, climbing, accelerating. The Zero's tracers passed below him. The Zero pilot had calculated lead based on Keller's initial speed and rate of acceleration. But Keller's Corsair had accelerated faster than the Zero pilot expected. The lead was wrong. The tracers missed. Keller came over the top, rolled inverted, pulled through. The Zero was below him, pulling up to follow. But the Zero was slow. Keller's Corsair had maintained energy through the maneuver. He pulled lead, fired, a 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage. The canopy shattered. The Zero rolled left and fell away trailing smoke.
Keller's first kill of the day. But there was no time to celebrate. His element leader was calling for help, 2 Zeros on his tail. Keller looked left, saw them. The Zeros were in firing position, 300 yards behind the lead Corsair, tracers streaming. The Corsair was weaving but not shaking them. Keller rolled hard, pulled toward them. He was low on energy from the previous engagement, needed to accelerate to intercept. He shoved the throttle forward again. Again, instant response. The engine hit maximum power in what felt like 1 second. The Corsair accelerated like it had been shot from a catapult. Keller closed on the trailing Zero at a rate that shouldn't have been possible. The Zero pilot saw him coming, broke off from the leader, reversed toward Keller. The two fighters passed each other head-on, both firing. Keller felt impacts. Something hit his port wing. He kept firing, saw his rounds tear into the Zero's engine. The Zero's propeller flew off. The engine seized. The Zero rolled and dove, dead in the air. 2 kills. The engagement had lasted 4 minutes. The third Zero came at him from above. Keller saw it late, diving fast. He was at low altitude, low speed, bad position. The Zero was perfectly set up. Keller's only option was to accelerate and extend, try to outrun the Zero in level flight. He firewalled the throttle. The response was instantaneous. His Corsair surged forward. The airspeed indicator wound up rapidly. 280, 310, 340, 370 miles per hour. The Zero was firing, but Keller was accelerating so fast the Zero pilot couldn't adjust his lead. The tracers arced behind the Corsair, falling away. At 400 miles per hour, Keller pulled up into a chandelle, trading speed for altitude. The Zero tried to follow, couldn't. The Corsair's acceleration had created separation the Zero couldn't close. Keller came around at the top of the chandelle, had the advantage. The Zero pilot knew it, dove away. Keller didn't chase. He was low on ammunition and fuel. He reformed with his element leader and headed home. When Keller landed at Piva Yoke at 13:20, Mora was waiting. Keller shut down the engine, climbed out. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking. He had a cut on his forehead from where his head had hit the gun sight during maneuvering. He walked straight to Mora. Keller said 2 words. It worked. What neither of them realized was that 4 Japanese pilots had noticed something impossible. One of them was Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata, 12 years in the Navy, 47 confirmed kills, one of Japan's top aces.
Shibata had been leading the Zero formation that intercepted Keller's flight. He'd been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. He knew how they flew, knew their aircraft, knew their limitations. He'd fought Wildcats, Hellcats, and Corsairs. He knew exactly how long it took each American fighter to accelerate from cruise power to combat power. The timing was critical to his tactics. When Shibata attacked an American fighter, he paid attention to the engine note. He could hear when the pilot advanced his throttle, could hear the engine begin to spool up, and he knew from experience that American fighters took approximately 3 to 4 seconds to go from cruise power to maximum power. During those 3 to 4 seconds, the American aircraft was vulnerable. It was accelerating, but not yet at maximum performance. If Shibata timed his attack correctly, he could close distance and shoot during that acceleration phase. The tactic had worked reliably for 18 months. Shibata had shot down 14 American fighters using exactly this method. He'd listen for the throttle advance, count in his head, know exactly when the American would reach maximum power, attack during the counting. By the time the American had full power, Shibata had either scored hits or forced the American into a defensive position. But on June 7th, something was different. Shibata had bounced a Corsair from above. The Corsair pilot saw him, advanced his throttle. Shibata heard the engine note change, started counting. 1, 2, 3. By 3 seconds, the Corsair should still be accelerating. Shibata closed distance, lined up his shot, but the Corsair was already at maximum power, already accelerating at full rate. Shibata's timing was wrong. He'd closed to firing position, but the Corsair had moved faster than expected. His lead was off. He missed. Shibata broke off, confused. He'd executed the same tactic hundreds of times. The timing should have been perfect, but this Corsair had accelerated faster than any American fighter he'd ever engaged, by at least 2 seconds. That shouldn't have been possible unless the Americans had modified their engines. But why would only one aircraft be modified? After the engagement, Shibata returned to Rabaul, filed his combat report, mentioned the anomaly. The intelligence officer asked for details. Shibata explained what he'd observed. The Corsair had accelerated faster than normal, significantly faster. The intelligence officer made a note but seemed unconcerned. Probably pilot error. Shibata might have misjudged the distance or the timing. One anomalous engagement didn't mean anything. But 3 days later, another experienced Zero pilot reported the same thing. He'd attacked a Corsair, timed his approach based on expected acceleration rate, but the Corsair had reached maximum power faster than anticipated. His attack had failed. A week after that, 2 more reports. Corsairs accelerating faster than they should. American fighters that had been predictable for months were suddenly responding differently.
By late June, Japanese pilots at Rabaul were discussing it openly. Something had changed with American Corsairs. They were accelerating faster. Not by much, maybe 2 seconds, but 2 seconds was enough to disrupt attack timing. Tactics that had worked reliably were suddenly failing. Pilots who'd been successful using throttle timing attacks were getting surprised, missing shots, taking return fire. Shibata tried to adapt. He changed his tactics, attacked from different angles, didn't rely on throttle timing. But the fundamental problem remained. The Americans' aircraft were responding faster. His advantage was gone. By July, Shibata had lost 3 wingmen to Corsairs. All 3 had been shot down after their attacks failed because they'd miscalculated the Americans' acceleration. The Americans weren't flying differently. Their aircraft were just responding faster than Japanese pilots had learned to expect. Back on Bougainville, word spread quickly. Keller told his squadron mates about his aircraft's performance. 3 kills in 1 mission, something he'd never achieved before. His Corsair had responded instantly every time he needed power. No delay, no waiting. It was like flying a different aircraft. By that evening, 4 other pilots had asked Mora if he could do the same modification to their aircraft. Mora said yes, but they needed to understand the risks. The modification wasn't approved, wasn't tested beyond Keller's aircraft. If something went wrong, everyone involved would face charges. The pilots said they didn't care. They'd watched too many friends get shot down because their engines wouldn't respond fast enough. If there was something that could help them survive, they wanted it. Regulations could wait. Over the next week, Mora modified 9 Corsairs. He showed 2 other mechanics how to do it. Cut the spring wire, bend it into the progressive resistance shape, install it in place of the original governor spring. Takes about 40 minutes. Changes everything. The modification spread through the squadron. By late June, 18 Corsairs at Piva Yoke had the modification. The pilots who flew them came back with stories. engines that responded instantly, acceleration that felt violent compared to the governed rate, zeros that couldn't time their attacks anymore, kill ratios that were improving. The statistics were undeniable. Before the modification, Marine Corsair pilots in the Solomons had been losing aircraft at a rate of 1.4 Corsairs for every zero destroyed. By mid-July, that ratio had reversed to 2.1 zeros destroyed for every Corsair lost. Something had changed. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henderson was the squadron commander. He noticed the statistics, called Mora to his office, asked directly what had been done to the aircraft. Mora explained the throttle governor modification, showed Henderson the modified spring wire, explained the theory behind it.
Henderson listened, asked if it was safe. Mora said he believed it was. The modification still protected the engine from damage. It just allowed faster response within safe parameters. Henderson asked if Mora had authorization for this modification. Mora said, "No, sir, he did not." Henderson sat quietly for a moment, then said he wouldn't file charges. The modification was working. Combat effectiveness had improved measurably. Pilots were surviving. But Mora needed to document exactly what he'd done, write a technical description, submit it through channels for official evaluation. In the meantime, no more modifications until there was guidance from higher command. Mora agreed. He wrote a 3-page technical report describing the modification, the theory, the results, submitted it to Henderson on July 3rd. Henderson forwarded it to Marine Air Group 14 headquarters on July 5th. It sat on a desk for 2 weeks while officers decided what to do with it. On July 20th, an engineering team from Naval Air Station San Diego arrived on Bougainville to evaluate the modification. 2 engineers and a test pilot. They examined the modified governor springs, measured throttle response times, flew test flights. After 3 days, they wrote their report. The modification was safe within the operational envelope of Marine Corps fighter operations. It reduced throttle response time from 3.8 seconds to 1.1 seconds without exceeding safe engine operating parameters. Combat effectiveness data from the squadron showed significant improvement in kill ratios and pilot survival rates. The engineers recommended official adoption with proper quality control on spring wire specifications and installation procedures. By September 1944, the modification was being installed on Corsairs across the Pacific Fleet. By November, it was standard on all new F4U 4 models leaving the factory. Chance Vought, the Corsair's manufacturer, integrated a similar system into their production throttle linkage. James Keller survived the war. He flew 48 combat missions, shot down 13 Japanese aircraft, returned to Nebraska in December 1945, married his girlfriend from high school, had 4 children, worked as a crop duster and flight instructor for 42 years. Every year on June 7th, he called Mora to thank him. Mora always said the same thing. He just made the aircraft work the way it should have from the beginning. Keller would say that those 2 seconds had saved his life multiple times. Mora would say he was glad it helped. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes. They repeated it for 38 years. Takeo Shibata survived the war. He was one of the few Japanese aces to live through the entire conflict, shot down 64 aircraft total. After the war, he worked for Mitsubishi, helped design post-war aircraft. In 1978, he met with American pilots at a veterans gathering in Hawaii. Keller was there. They talked about the war. Shibata mentioned the Corsairs that had started accelerating faster in mid-1944, said it had disrupted Japanese tactics significantly. Asked what the Americans had done. Keller explained about the throttle governor modification. Shibata laughed, said such a simple change had cost Japan dozens of pilots. Sometimes, he said, the smallest modifications have the largest impact. Daniel Mora stayed in the Marines until 1946, returned to Los Angeles, went to engineering school on the GI Bill, worked for Lockheed from 1950 to 1988 as a power plant engineer, worked on the P-80, F-104, and later the C-130. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes. That was all.
Daniel Mora died in 2004 at age 83. He was buried in Riverside National Cemetery in California. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic with Marine Air Group 14. It mentioned his 40-year career at Lockheed. It did not mention the Throttle governor modification. Did not mention that he'd changed how Corsairs fought. Did not mention that he'd saved dozens of lives by breaking regulations with a piece of modified spring wire. But at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, there's an F4U Corsair on display. If you look at the information placard, it mentions that field modifications by Marine mechanics in 1944 improved the Corsair's throttle response and combat effectiveness. It doesn't name Daniel Mora, but pilots who flew Corsairs with the modification know, and that's enough. That's how innovation actually happens in war, through corporals who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Through mechanics who understand that sometimes the right answer violates the regulations. Through people who know that bringing pilots home matters more than following the manual. If you found this story as compelling as we did, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more forgotten stories from the Second World War, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.